Rick, maybe let me pick up. This course is interesting for me. It's difficult for me because I usually go 10 or 15 hours a day dealing with contemporary events in politics, and it's hard for me to disassociate what happened in the 60s from what's happening today. In fact, before I came here this evening, had a meeting in my office with people involved in the Burlington Peace Movement, talking about tactics. How do we build a movement? How do we deal with Nicaragua, which is in many ways Vietnam, except it's worse and it's more gross. So it's hard for me. It's going to be enjoyable because it allows me an opportunity to do something that I often don't have the time to do, and that is to reflect a little bit. But I'm probably not going to do it as well as I should be able to because I am caught up very much in the day-to-day activity, and it's difficult. But let me start off by saying, as I reflect, one of the events that stands out in my life is I spent 1 year at Brooklyn College. I was born and raised in Brooklyn. I went to public high school there. Then I went to the University of Chicago. And a thing that I remember very deeply, I became involved in the civil rights movement. And we had a sit-in demonstration to protest racial discrimination in Chicago. The university itself was and is a major landowner in the city of Chicago. In fact, it's one of the wealthiest institutions in the city of Chicago. You have the Catholic Church, the university, and so forth. And the university owned massive amounts of property worth hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And it turned out what we had done is we had a biracial group of people. We had white young people going into an apartment house that was owned by the university and would say, I'm interested in getting an apartment. And I said, well, fill out the forms and da-da-da, I'll come back tomorrow. And we had some black friends going in and they said, sorry, we have no vacancies here. And we learned, students themselves learned that the university was owning a segregated property. And this, of course, the University of Chicago was one of the great institutions in America and also one of the quote-unquote liberal institutions. And to make a very long story short, the students became mobilized and there was a sit-in demonstration. And what I remember probably most profoundly was we had meetings with the president of the university then, who had been a Nobel Prize winner and so forth, very distinguished, wonderful gentleman, and he lied cold right to our face, dead lied. And it was rather shocking. It was rather shocking, and I'd say that was an important event in my life. We're dealing with all these important, impressive, wonderful people, and they lied. And that was very startling to me, and it made me begin on a personal level to begin to understand a little bit about what the world was about. Rick mentions John F. Kennedy and so forth. My reaction was different. At this point, why one becomes the way we become, or you become who you are, or I become who I am, or Rick, God only knows. We don't know, really. The thousand forces, our parents, the early upbringing, to make us who we are. But I always had a rebellious streak in me, which is not manifested in political activity. I knew nothing about politics, and my parents were not political. My brother was a little bit, not much. But I remember, for some reason or other, being very excited when Fidel Castro made the revolution in Cuba. I was a kid, and I remember reading that. And it was just seemed right and appropriate that poor people were rising up against rather ugly rich people. And I remember, again, very distinctly, a very distinct feeling. I was watching the debates. You remember the famous Nixon-Kennedy debates. That was the first time the presidential candidates actually debated. And I was becoming increasingly interested in politics. Didn't know much, but was interested. I remember sitting in the student lounge at our dormitory watching the debate. And at that time, well, we can talk about Cuba now, I was very excited and impressed by the Cuban Revolution. And there was Kennedy and Nixon talking about which particular method they should use about destroying the revolution. And I remember the irony, as we learned the history later on, Kennedy was saying that Nixon was too soft on communism. Let me pick up a point that Rick was making. In Cuba, we should deal firmly with Fidel Castro. And Nixon was playing the role of, hey, you got to be patient. You know, you can't do these things. You got to negotiate. Well, of course, what he was upset about is that secretly they were planning the Bay of Pigs invasion right then. But for security reasons, he couldn't come out and say, we're already planning the destruction of the Cuban Revolution. Don't worry about it. So he was the liberal, and Kennedy was playing the conservative. And actually, you know, when you read novels, people say there's a sick feeling in your stomach. Usually I'm sufficiently unemotional not to be sick, but I actually got up from the room and almost left to puke. Because for the first time in my adult life, what I was seeing is the Democrats and the Republicans, both of them, and of course, as Rick points out, Kennedy was the flashing young liberal. And what we were seeing right before my eyes, way, way back then, and I didn't know anything about politics, but clearly that there really wasn't a whole lot of difference between the two. The 60s, for me, was a period, I think to understand the 60s, you have to understand the racial situation in the country at that time.